Good morning all. I'm not quite sure that I'll be able to turn the tide, but I'm going to try and provide some ideas on what might change that. To start with, I'm going to put into context the headline 40 million down to 14, because it gives us some indication of what happened, that it was probably not an irrational reaction from industry, and what lessons we'll get from that for the future. The key thing is that it's been a transition from a wool industry to a sheep, meat and wool industry, and that explains a lot of what has happened. I'm going to explain that while the headline figure, the drop from 40 to 14, hasn't just occurred by itself, there have been other things, particularly productivity improvements in the industry. Then I'm going to discuss what might turn that around, the 4 Ps, price, productivity, profitability and popularity, and then finish up by highlighting what are perhaps some signs that growth is going to happen or is starting to occur. This chart shows the change in the flock number in Western Australia, something you're familiar with, and I specifically started this from 1983 to show that there was a period during my employment at the Department of Agriculture when the flock was actually rising. The 1980s were a period of optimism in the wool industry. Prices were high, profitability was good, demand was extreme. It was also a period when the price was underpinned by a minimum reserve price scheme. The end of the 80s saw the end of a period of world economic growth. We had a perfect storm. We had Tiananmen Square, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and demand or purchases of wool from China slowed. As the price dropped at the end of the 80s, the Australian Wool Corporation, which was running a minimum reserve price scheme, had to start buying more and more of the wool. That's not advancing. It got to the stage by 1991 where the corporation had bought 4.7 million bales. To put that in context, it's a bit over twice the production of wool in Australia for a year currently. We saw that dramatic, I can't really point to this, saw that dramatic rise in the price of wool to $12.76 in 1988. It was in a decade the price doubled. Then as demand dropped, we saw the price drop, and that's why the corporation was buying more and more wool. The 1990s were defined by the end of that wool price scheme, a drop in price and flock liquidation, or perhaps I should say the start of flock liquidation. In Western Australia, the producer response was to either reduce sheep numbers, usually in favour of other enterprises, and to expand into cropping, and some would get out of sheep altogether. The 1990s into the early 2000s was also the period when the stockpile was being liquidated. There was an orderly disposal scheme, and that weighed heavily on the price of wool, and so it continued down. The last bale of stockpile wool was sold in April 2002, full 10 years and a bit after that. But from around the turn of the century, wool price has been trending upwards. This has been driven largely by a lack of supply, as the stockpile, of course, was gone and sheep numbers were down. So that by this current year, year to date, the average price is now $14, above that $12.70 peak back in 1988. I'll point out, though, that they're nominal prices. In real terms, we're still not back there. I also point out that last week the wool indicator that I've got the average of for this year was a full $2, more than $2 above that. It was over $16, so the price is good. The 1990s was also the time when the lamb meat industry was born. Prior to the 1990s, the lamb industry was largely a byproduct of a wool industry. There was slow production growth, it had a poor reputation, and consumption was falling. Despite the take-off in the lamb industry, the West Australian flock is still merino dominant. Something like 80% of the breeding ewes are merino. Another small proportion or biggest sector of the rest are first cross, and then there are some maternal meat breed and of course some shedding, but they're by far the minority, and they remain the minority to today. The transfer to a lamb industry, or the uptake of lamb, is challenging in Western Australia. We have a Mediterranean climate with a short green feed window. It's difficult for producers to finish those lambs in that period, so feeding is critical and the timing is critical. Over the last decade, perhaps 2 decades, lamb meat prices have been growing and have been very strong. In fact, MLA have pointed out that sheep meat, or lamb, is the only main commodity produced in Australia that has had real growth in price over the last couple of decades. As the sheep numbers have gone down, the area under crop has increased. Remember that most of the sheep in Western Australia are on farms that are both cropping and grazing. The area since 1990 under crop has gone up by 40%, so there's been an increased emphasis on cropping. The consequences of an increase in cropping, the reduction in sheep numbers, particularly on those farms that have completely destocked, is that they've removed fences, removed watering points. Sheep facilities have deteriorated, particularly yards and sheds for shearing. The consequence of increasing cropping has been a bigger investment, and with it debt in machinery, and that tends to ratchet up the reliance on cropping and makes it that much more difficult to go back to sheep, because those expensive pieces of machinery have a debt that needs to be repaid. And for those farms that have completely destocked, there's also the problem that they no longer have sheep as an option for weed management, which is a problem when herbicide resistance rears its head. They also lose out on price risk management. They don't have the extra product for those poor seasons when the sheep will still produce a wool clip even if the crop's not there. And if they have no sheep and the crop fails, it can't even be converted to stock feed. Apart from the change in the size of the flock, there's been a dramatic change in the composition. Once wool ceased to be the overriding focus of the industry, wethers ceased to be as important, and they've been largely phased out. Conversely, with lamb production as an important component of the farm income, reproduction, producing more lambs, has been increasingly important. As a wool enterprise, you only need to produce enough offspring to replace culls and losses. When those lambs become a product, or shippers at 18 months become a key product, then you need to produce more, and the more you produce, the more money you make. In 1990, there were just over 17 million ewes. Today, it's a touch over 8. What's particularly interesting is that from those 8 million ewes, we are now slaughtering more lambs, producing more lambs, about 2.5 million per year, 1 million more than we were able to process when we had 17 million ewes. The focus has completely changed. Conversely, back in 1990, there was about 12 million wethers in the flock. Today, we couldn't scratch together 1 million. Lamb has also, of course, become a key component, a major component of the flock, largely because when the statistics are collected in the middle of the year, there's plenty of them on the ground to count. Later in the year, when they've been sold, there's fewer. I'd now like to just quickly touch on the progress that the industry's made. Implicit in the statement from 14 million to 14 is the conclusion that perhaps the industry's failing. But if we just look at how the industry would have been performing on 14 million sheep today if the biological performance was as it was 20 years ago, lambs have gone up by about 3 kilos, so we've got increased carcass weight there, increased carcass weight of the sheep slaughtered for mutton production, results in about $58 million more, or had they been performing today the way they were 20 years ago, we'd have lost 58 million. Increased marking rates account for a further 35 million in lamb turn-off, and this is where that increased marking rate, I've allocated them between lamb turn-off and live export as they are today, and the live export would have gone up by an extra 24 million, or we would have lost 24 million if our marking rate was that much lower. Wool quality, the fineness of the clip has come down a couple of micron, improving its value, and we've increased the wool cut, the amount of wool per head. That accounts for 48. So for $1 billion industry, those productivity gains, despite the fact we've only got a 14 million, are worth about 185 million a year. So coming up towards 20% more. So the industry hasn't failed, it's adapted. I'd now like to turn attention to what might drive growth. And I put it into 3 categories, categorised it. Price, of course, is important, but it's not just the higher, the better. Need to improve productivity. Producing more from the same or fewer resources is better if profitability also goes up. And running sheep has to be desirable. For the industry to grow, people want to have to run sheep. Let's look at it in more detail. Good commodity prices are important. And here I say good, not high, because if the price is too high, then the processors and exporters, the people further down the supply chain, won't make a profit. That's what happened with the wool industry back in the late 80s. The price was so high that those that wanted it couldn't afford to buy it. Other products were substituted. The price has to be high enough for farmers to choose to run sheep enterprises, whether that's merino for wool or prime lamb, rather than some other enterprise. Grains typically were perceived to be more profitable through the 80s and 90s, through the 90s and early 2000, and as a result there was a lot of farmers shifted from wool or sheep to crops. Also need to have confidence. It's not enough to just have a good price, but one has to have confidence. The investment cycle in changing enterprises, in growing a new product for market takes time, and if those prices are a spike that's just going to be temporary, it's not going to work. And if those things come together, then there will be an incentive to invest if the economics add up. Market mechanisms. By that I mean some way that those that want to run sheep or considering running sheep can find out what the price will be, what they will get, what quality they need to produce, and be paid according to that quality. It's not just a single commodity like a BHP share or something else that has just one specification. They need to know forward pricing is a component of that, and understanding what price somebody will pay, knowing that for the future. Take the example of a light lamb. At the end of the year, after harvest, the farmer is weighing up the decision whether to get rid of those light lambs, sell them to a feeder, sell them for the light lamb air freight job to the Middle East, or whether they'll forego the holiday with the family, stay around, cart water, cart feed, look after the animal health of that sheep, grow it through to 18 months, produce a good value shipper. They need to know what the price will be for that 18-month-old shipper 12 months hence, so they can make a decision whether it's worth the cost, it's worth the risk of carrying that lamb through the summer and what impact it has on their stock. Unless they've got the confidence that yes, in 12 months' time, in 18 months' time, that animal will have a price that pays for their cost, then it's an easy decision to say, no, I'll get rid of it now, I won't wear those risks, and the shippers lose out. They haven't got the best out of that lamb probably because it could grow more. They pass that to somebody else. So forward pricing mechanism, something that will give them confidence, is important. Out of season production. Because of the nature of our production cycle, a lot of the lambs will come to market at one time of the year. There's a supply glut. The processing industry, the exporting industry to a certain extent, would prefer that production was spread over the year. But it costs more to produce those lambs out of season. Economic analysis by economists in the southwest suggests that you need an extra 30 to 35 cents per kilo per month to carry those lambs to a later delivery date. Currently the market offers about 16 cents, so there's a shortfall there. It makes the decision as to whether they want to carry them fairly easy. They don't get the profit. Having trouble with this button. And finally, contracts. There's a lot of talk about contracts for forward delivery, for delivery at some time. Often they are just expressions of interest, they're just bids, they're not enforceable. It would be good for the sheep meat industry, for the live shipping, if there were contracts, I believe, that were enforceable, that could be used to give confidence of the delivery. It works both ways. While preparing this talk, I had a call from a ex-DAFWA economist who's now a wife of a farmer who'd been offered a 3-year contract to buy their entire wool clip. Been given what was probably a good price, but she was dithering over whether it was enough, whether the price was going to go up. So even when a good price is offered, human nature comes in. So I'm not saying contracts are easy. I'm not saying that the uptake will be universal, but it's important. Improving productivity and profitability. Growing the farm flock. The surest way to produce more is to increase the stocking rate. Run more sheep, produce more livestock, produce more wool, make more profit. But it has to be done well. As you increase the stocking rate, as you put more pressure on the system, management becomes more important. The timing of every decision is critical. Getting them wrong is a problem. Past practice has been to set the stocking rate at a low stocking rate, something to handle a poor season. That way they think that if the season's poor, they'll still carry those stock. The reality is that even in the poor seasons, they end up destocking. Better that they run at a higher stocking rate, produce more in each year, waste less of the feed, but have an exit strategy, have a way planned and put it into practice, not just have it and hope that things are going to change, so that they can handle those poor seasons. To run more sheep, not only has management got to be better, we've got to make use of the equipment that's available. There are new machines, machinery, practices that are helping farmers handle more sheep. It's a hands-on job. They need to be able to handle more sheep with less hands-on. Improve reproductive performance. Not only can you run more sheep per hectare, but if you can produce more lambs from those breeding ewes, then you're going to make more profit. More lambs, I would say, yeah. And how can you put all these together? There are training programs out there. I'll list a couple: lifetime ewe management, sheep's back. These programs specifically targeted at helping people manage their system better. The lifetime ewe management program, for instance, has been rolled out over a large number of producers right across Australia. On average, they've had 30% more lambs weaned per hectare due to a 15% increase in stocking rate, 50% reduction in ewe mortality, and a 15% increase in weaning rate. So there are practices out there. The people that take them up can do better. And when they do better, we get better animal welfare outcomes. There's better animal health, fewer losses of lambs, of weaners, fewer losses of ewes, and the sheep are in better condition. It's also important, as I said before, the majority of the sheep are run on mixed farms. There are complementarities to be recognised between running sheep with crops. I already mentioned herbicide resistance or management of weeds through herbicide resistance, but there's grazing stubbles. There's a number of advantages. The economics analysis has always shown that running the two together was more profitable than running one alone, and in a risk situation, it's certainly better. And finally, benchmarking is one of those things that kind of fits under productivity and profitability. Unless you know where you're performing relative to other producers, you don't know whether there's an opportunity for you to improve. Largely the benchmarking services that are offered by individual consultancies, and those individual consultancies run their own in-house practice. If we had a better global standard for benchmarking production, then there's a better opportunity. A couple of the farm consultants that I spoke with pointed out that in their groups, in a small geographical area, in the same year, there was more variation in the profitability per hectare of the same enterprise, whether that was wool production or prime lamb production, between farmers than there was between the different enterprises. So management is very important, and benchmarking is the way to know whether they're in the top or at the bottom of that range. I think it's an opportunity waiting to happen, and I know it won't be easy to implement. Make sheep a desirable enterprise. In a survey that I was involved in back in the Department of Agriculture days, we talked to a large number of producers, 300 I think it was, in the southwest of Western Australia, and some of those weren't in sheep anymore. Some of them were only in beef. We asked them, why, or what would it need to do, what will we need to do to get them back into sheep? A large proportion said they don't like running sheep, they have no interest in running sheep, they don't desire to run sheep. They're a lost cause for the industry. We need to turn that around. A lot of the young producers that have left sheep or have only joined the cropping fraternity like machinery, they like the technology. The industry needs a clear vision needs to have a picture there of what it can, or what it might be, where it's going, so that people are keen to be involved. And we have the sheep meat industry strategic plan, AWI's equivalent for the wool industry. The Sheep Alliance of Western Australia is bringing the whole supply chain together to promote a vision and a cooperation. I know when I left the department, the royalties for regions were funding the Sheep Industry Business Innovation Project, and that's running to this day, helping the industry with its a positive image that will bring enthusiasm and talent and people that want to invest in the sheep industry. That's very important. I'm just being told I'm about to finish. We need to bring a technology buzz to the industry. Cropping's had it with GPS-enabled tractors and all sorts of things. We need to have it. The use of sensors, pedigreeing lambs, matching lambs to their mums was a horrible job that was done very early in the frosty mornings. About a decade ago, RFID tags, radio frequency tags, were brought in, and you could put one of these on a ewe and a lamb, and they walk past a sensor panel, and with a few weeks' data, you could work out which lamb was most associated with which sheep. The exciting advances that have happened now are we're looking at having proximity sensors on collars that are put on the ewe and the lamb, Bluetooth sensors basically that register a hit when the two come together within a metre. Now, in 24 hours with those collars on lambs and ewes, you can get it. This is technology that's advancing. Drones. What's not to love about sending a drone out to do the hard work, to check the pasture quantity, how much feed's there, rather than having to drive around early in the morning or during the day. Development of tools for the iGeneration. There's probably more than half of us in this room have pulled out our smartphone this morning and checked something or done something. The same with farmers. Once the internet gets to those remote locations, tools that allow them to be told when there's sheep with fly strike, or told when there's some other action that's needed. They're the sorts of things that will bring back those people. One of the buzzes that's around now is the possibility of using blockchain technology to carry the information about the growth and performance of the sheep, how it's performing, its full pedigree, to give a provenance to that information so that it can carry it down the chain. Wouldn't it be wonderful if a processor knew what they needed to fill a particular order and could translate that information to a feedlot to select a particular type of animal that needs to be delivered in 6 weeks, and that feedlot knew which sheep to look for, what quality attributes they needed, and could interrogate a database of sheep on farms to select the right animals to be drafted off, having a virtual fencing system that actually picked which animal was drafted, put into the pen, so the next day they're all loaded on the truck, delivered to the feedlot, and 6 weeks later or 5 weeks later they're ready because they were the right type of animal, and the full provenance is there with this technology. And if we bring all of this together, if it all comes to the point where it's profitable, it's attractive, it will create interest and investors will want to come. I spoke with a group of farm consultants who were very much into supporting cropping, but when we talked about sheep, they said, show us the economic argument, show us the business model that will be profitable, people will find the money to get into sheep. So it's possible. I'll just quickly go through options for flock expansion. You can buy a new flock, purchase 1.5-year-old ewe replacements. It's an expensive option, but it has the fastest payback. You can increase lambing percentage. That's a practical approach, and it's an approach that will keep the flock growing quicker because it's not just a one-off change, it's there forever. Retaining older ewes, an option that's typically used when rebuilding after drought. It's a very slow process. You can only make a small increase, suitable if it's 20 to 30%. Increasing ewe lamb retention, is another option, but those that are heavily invested in a split product producing prime lambs as well as wool have less merino used to self-replace, so it's not an option for them. Are there any signs of flock expansion? This is the last slide, I promise. ABARES, their forecast says that there's flock rebuilding, but tempered by seasons. MLA's survey, this was the June survey, suggested that there's a strong intent to maintain or increase breeding ewe flock. So it's holding, it's not going down, but again, in those areas where seasonal conditions are less than favourable, there's a problem. Ram sales have been particularly strong. In this state, I'm told, DAFA has told us that the price paid for merino rams is 24% higher on average this year than last year, and last year was 9% above the previous year. There was an increase in the number sold. I think it was 7% more. South African breeds also went up in price. There was a contraction in both price and number of British breed rams. So perhaps the wool price, current high wool price is dragging people back towards the merino. Perhaps it's a recovery from an overuse of terminal sires and a lack of replacement ewes. Both lamb and sheep slaughter are down so far this year for the full 10 months, I think, 9 months of data, perhaps indicating that there's a retention happening, that there is a build, though it's accelerated a little bit in the last few months, probably due to the mid-year dry season. Field day attendance, I'm told by consultants, is very strong. A lot of people are really craving information on how to run sheep, so that's very positive. The general consensus from those people I spoke to is that it's the people with a flock that will expand it. There's not much interest in starting new flocks. That probably reflects the high price of buying sheep to get into it. But that may well change. And finally, the biggest indicator is the smiles on the face of farmers when they see the current prices. Thank you.